This podcast contains content generated or significantly edited using artificial intelligence tools. All information is provided for general informational purposes only and reflects knowledge available at the time of publication. It does not constitute financial, investment, or legal advice. We recommend that listeners verify the information independently and consult with qualified professionals for personalized advice. Welcome to the Luxembourg Fundcast. Okay, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that, sounds super legalistic on the surface. Multi-jurisdictional fund restructuring.
Right. It sounds like something you'd only find in thick legal textbooks.
Exactly. But what we're going to explore is how this is actually a massive project management exercise, too, like really high-stakes stuff.
It absolutely is. One wrong move, and you're looking at serious delays, costs spiraling. It's a complex balancing act.
So the mission for this deep dive.
Well, we're going to sift through our source material on this, pull out the really crucial bits for you. Think of it as a shortcut to understanding how to apply that project management discipline to what often gets pigeonholed as just a legal job.
Yeah, managing all those approvals, different stakeholders across borders, it's intense.
Definitely.
And we've identified three really critical takeaways that could honestly change how you approach these projects.
Mm-hmm.
First, we'll look at the big impact of Luxembourg's new mobility framework. It's a real game changer.
It certainly is.
Second, we're zeroing in on legal opinions, why they aren't just formalities, but actual critical project dependencies. You can't move without them.
Spot on. They're gatekeepers in their own right.
And third, this idea of conflict of laws. We'll unpack how there are actually two different kinds of conflicts in these restructurings and why you need separate strategies for each.
That distinction is key.
All right, let's dive in. To really get the project management angle, we first need to grasp the legal foundations, especially these big shifts in Luxembourg. What's the main law we're talking about?
Okay, so the big one is the Luxembourg Law of 17 February 2025. This is huge because it brings the EU's Mobility Directive, that's Directive 21/21/21, into Luxembourg law.
And the point of that directive was?
Essentially, to create one clear, harmonized set of rules across the EU for companies doing cross-border conversions, mergers, or divisions. Limited liability companies specifically.
Right, trying to simplify things, get rid of the old patchwork system.
Exactly. Before this, it was often a real headache navigating different national rules for these kinds of deals. This aims to streamline it all.
Makes sense. So if I'm a project manager mapping this out, when did these rules actually kick in? Are there specific dates I need circle in red?
Yes, absolutely crucial for scheduling. The law itself came into force on March 2nd, 2025.
Okay, March 2nd.
But specifically for the restructuring plans themselves, the new rules apply if the draft terms were published on or after April 1st, 2025.
April 1st. Got it. So a very clear cutoff.
Yeah.
No ambiguity there.
Pretty much. It tells you exactly which set of rules you're playing under.
And this new law, I understand, it brought in a kind of dual prac system. It's not just one size fits all.
That's right. And it's a really important strategic point. There are two regimes now. First, you have the special regime.
Okay.
This is the new harmonized framework from the Mobility Directive. It applies to cross-border deals within the EU or the European Economic Area, the EEA, and specifically for Luxembourg companies like the SA, the SIRL, or the SCA.
Those are the main limited liability forms, right? Société anonyme, société à responsabilité limitée.
Société en commandite par action, exactly. And this special regime, it comes with, let's say, more rigorous procedures, more hoops to jump through.
Okay, so that's track one. What's track two?
Track two is the general regime. This basically continues the older Luxembourg rules. It covers purely domestic restructuring, so Luxembourg to Luxembourg.
Great.
And importantly, it also covers cross-border deals involving entities from outside the EU or EEA. So if you're merging with a U.S. company, for example.
So that gives Luxembourg flexibility for deals with, say, the UK or US.
Precisely. The strategic point here is you really need to know which track your deal falls onto. Use the special regime rules for a simple domestic deal, and you've overcomplicated things. Use the general regime for an EU deal, and you've missed critical requirements.
That seems vital for fund managers. But does this new special regime apply directly to, like, a UCI's fund or an AIF itself?
Excellent question, and here's where the nuance is critical. The short answer is no. The special regime does not directly apply to undertakings for collective investment UCIs.
So not UCIs or regulated AIFs.
Correct. They have their own specific rules. For UCIs mergers, for instance, you look at the Law of 17 December 2010 and CSSF Regulation 1005.
Okay, that's clear.
Yeah.
But is there a catch?
There is, and it's a big one for fund structures. If the restructuring involves corporate holding companies within the fund structure.
Like SPVs or intermediate holding companies?
Exactly. And if those holding companies are SAS, SARLS, or SCS, their merger would fall under this new mobility law and the special regime if it's cross-border within the EUEA.
Okay. So it's not the fund itself, but potentially companies inside the fund structure. You need to look closely at the legal forms involved.
Absolutely. It requires careful legal checking right at the start of the project plan. You need to map out the correct legal path early on.
Okay, so focusing on that special regime for a moment, if I'm a project manager, what's the biggest, practical change that's going to affect my timeline and risk assessment? I keep hearing about the notary's role changing quite dramatically.
You've hit the nail on the head. This is probably the most significant operational shift. Under the special regime, the Luxembourg civil law notary isn't just checking procedural boxes anymore. They are now mandated to perform a formal anti-abuse control. They have to do this before they can issue the pre-merger certificate.
And that certificate is essential.
Absolutely non-negotiable. Without it, the deal can't proceed. It's the document that confirms to the authorities in the other country that the Luxembourg part of the deal is legally sound.
So the notary is no longer just verifying signatures and documents.
Yeah.
They're making a judgment call.
Precisely. They have gone from procedural verifier to substantive gatekeepers. They are now a strategic risk factor in your project.
Wow. Judging intent, almost. How does that work? What are they looking for?
They have the power to refuse the certificate if they have serious suspicions that the deal is set up for abusive, fraudulent, or criminal purposes.
Like what specifically?
Things like trying to improperly get around employee rights, dodge taxes or Social Security payments, or harm the rights of creditors or minority shareholders.
Okay, so this isn't a tick box exercise anymore. This sounds subjective. How do you plan for that in a project?
It completely changes the game from a project management standpoint. You now must have an explicit work stream in your plan. Let's call it notary justification and pre-clearance.
Right.
This means preparing solid documentation explaining the commercial reasons for the deal. Why does it make business sense? And you need to engage with the notary much earlier, proactively.
And the timeline impact. This sounds like it could add significant delays.
Huge potential impact. You absolutely have to build in significant contingency time. This scrutiny process alone can take up to 3 months, and it can even be renewed.
3 months, just for the notary check.
Potentially, yes. If you don't factor that in, this new gatekeeping role could completely derail your project very late in the day. High impact, high uncertainty risk, needs careful management.
And it's not just the notary gaining power, right? The Mobility Directive also beefed up rights for other stakeholders, creating new project tasks.
That's right. More mandatory deliverables and dependencies for your plan. For shareholders, particularly dissenting minority ones, the special regime gives them a right of withdrawal.
Meaning they can just ask for their money back.
Essentially, yes. They can demand adequate cash compensation for their shares if they vote against the deal. This immediately adds a potential financial payout you need to model and budget for.
Okay, what about creditors?
They get stronger safeguards, too. If they have claims that existed before the draft merger terms were published, they can go to court within 3 months of publication.
To do what? Block the merger.
To ask for protection if they can show the deal puts their claims at risk. So you need to address creditor concerns much earlier in the timeline now. It's an accelerated dependency.
And employees. I heard their rights were boosted significantly.
They were. Their rights to information, consultation, and participation are much stronger now. And crucially, these rights are extended to cross-border conversions and divisions for the first time, not just mergers.
So more reports, more consultation needed.
Yes. Management has to prepare a detailed report specifically for employees. It has to explain the impact on jobs and working conditions, and it must be provided at least 6 weeks before the shareholder meeting that votes on the deal.
6 weeks. Another hard deadline for the project plan.
Absolutely. These are all concrete, time-sensitive deliverables for your communication plan, your legal compliance plan. It adds layers.
Wow. Okay, that paints a clear picture of the new legal hurdles. So let's pivot now. We've mapped the legal terrain. Let's talk project management tools. For these cross-border deals, you often hear about conflict of laws. It sounds complicated. And you mentioned earlier it's actually 2 different issues.
Exactly. Let's break down dependency management and this dual conflict of laws. It's a core challenge in cross-border projects, and for fund restructurings, it shows up in 2 distinct ways. First, you have the classic legal problem: private international law.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It's about figuring out which country's actual laws apply to which part of the deal. The classic example is security interests. Let's say you have a loan governed by English law,
Boy.
but it's secured by a pledge over a bank account held in Luxembourg.
Okay, common scenario.
Well, the validity and enforcement of that pledge itself will be governed by Luxembourg law, specifically the Law 5 August 2005 on financial collateral arrangements. That's the principle of lexitus, the law where the asset is located.
So even if the main loan doc is English, the Luxembourg asset needs Luxembourg rules.
Precisely, which is why your project plan must include parallel legal work streams. You need Luxembourg lawyers advising on the Luxembourg bits, English lawyers on the English bits, and so on. The project manager has to map these dependencies meticulously.
Okay, that's conflict number one. Which country's law applies where? What's the second type?
The second type is regulatory conflicts of interest. This is a completely separate obligation coming directly from fund regulations like AIFMD, the UCITS directive, the CIF law in Luxembourg.
So this is a fund-specific regulatory duty.
Yes. Who has this duty? Primarily the fund's management company, the ManCo, or AIFM.
Okay, and what do they have to do?
They are legally required to establish, implement, and maintain a written, effective conflicts of interest policy. It's not optional.
And the purpose of the policy.
To identify potential conflicts, prevent them where possible, manage the ones that arise, monitor them, and disclose them appropriately.
Where do these conflicts typically pop up in a restructuring?
They can arise in several places: between the manager and the fund itself, perhaps if the manager benefits disproportionately from the deal, or between two different funds managed by the same manager if they're merging, or even between the fund and its investors.
Right, lots of potential friction points. So how do you manage this from a project perspective?
You need to treat it as a concrete project task. Your plan, maybe using a Gantt chart, needs to explicitly map these potential conflicts and the steps to manage them. You need activities like apply conflicts policy, update conflicts register, implement resolution procedures.
Resolution procedures like
Having a director with a potential conflict formally declare it and then recuse themselves from voting on that specific matter. It turns that regulatory requirement into actionable project steps with clear evidence of compliance.
That's a really useful distinction between the two types of conflict. Okay, moving on to another crucial document, the legal opinion as your jurisdictional green light. We touched on it, but let's unpack its role.
Sure. The legal opinion is fundamental. Think of it as a formal assurance certificate. Who issues it? It's always a qualified law firm in a specific jurisdiction, say, a Lux firm opining on Lux law. And it's issued to another party in the deal, like the lender providing finance or the company acquiring the fund.
And why is it so essential? Why can't the deal close without it?
Because it provides formal comfort to the recipient about the legal nuts and bolts of the deal in that specific jurisdiction. It confirms things like, are the documents legally valid? Are they binding? Are they enforceable? It's almost always a non-negotiable condition precedent a CP before any money changes hands.
Okay. And what exactly is it, and where does its scope lie?
It's a formal letter. It gives specific legal conclusions, but, and this is important, it's strictly limited to the laws of the jurisdiction the firm is qualified in, as those laws stand on the date the opinion is issued. It's not business advice. It's not a guarantee the deal is commercially sound.
It's purely about legal validity and enforceability under that specific law.
Exactly. Typically covering things like, is the fund company properly incorporated? Does it have the legal power and authority to do this deal? Were the documents signed correctly? Are the key obligations legally enforceable? Does the deal conflict with the fund's own constitutional documents?
You mentioned negotiation earlier. It sounds like getting this opinion finalized isn't just a formality, but a whole process in itself, a sort of mini project.
That's a perfect way to describe it. It's definitely not just signing on the dotted line. The side receiving the opinion will naturally want it to be as broad and clean as possible.
Right, maximum assurance.
But the law firm issuing it has their professional reputation and liability on the line. So they'll want to narrow the scope where appropriate and include necessary assumptions, things they're taking for granted, like documents being authentic, and qualifications, which are exceptions or limitations to the opinions.
Like saying the opinion doesn't cover potential bankruptcy scenarios, for instance.
Exactly. Things like the impact of insolvency laws or the fact that courts always have some discretion. This back and forth negotiation over the precise wording takes time, significant time. And of course, it involves legal fees on both sides.
So how should a project manager handle this? You can't just put get legal opinion on the plan.
Absolutely not. A good PM will break it down. You'll have subtasks like distribute first draft opinion, receive comments from recipients' counsel, negotiate assumptions and qualifications, agree final wording.
Much more granular.
Yes. This allows for better tracking, better forecasting of time and cost. And crucially, it highlights why you need to kick off this opinion process early. It often sits squarely on the critical path to closing. Leaving it too late is a classic way projects get delayed right at the finish line.
Breaking it down like that really shows the hidden work involved.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the main event. The art of legal negotiation in the actual fund merger agreement. This is where everything comes together, right?
It really is. It's a complex negotiation involving multiple parties, often with very different goals. Who are the main players at the table? You've got the management teams from both the buyer and seller sides. You've got their M&A team's legal finance people. And if financing is involved, the lenders and their lawyers are key players too.
And what are they actually negotiating? Obviously price, but what else?
Price is just the start. Key negotiation points include the form of payment cash, shares, or a mix. Then there are the representations and warranties, basically, statements of fact about the business being sold. The scope of these is heavily negotiated. And crucially, how risk is allocated. Who pays if something goes wrong later? This comes down to indemnification clauses, maybe escrow accounts, and sometimes things like reverse breakup fees.
Okay. And why does this negotiation happen, and when does it get most intense?
The fundamental why is simple. To reach a deal both sides can live with. It's about balancing the buyer's need to minimize risk and the seller's desire to maximize value. As for when, it's usually phased. It might start with a non-binding letter of intent or term sheet, but the really intense, detailed negotiation of the final agreement usually ramps up after the buyer has done their due diligence and knows exactly what they're buying.
Makes sense. So how do you manage this complex negotiation process effectively from a project management standpoint? Any tips?
Several key things. First, preparation is everything. Your leverage comes from thorough due diligence. Know the asset, know the risks, go in with clear objectives, know your walkaway points, your absolute deal breakers.
Read prepared. Got it.
Second, try to control the draft. If you're the one providing the first draft of the merger agreement, you frame the whole discussion. The other side then has to argue points into your document, which is psychologically harder.
Interesting tactic. What else?
Third, run a disciplined process. Have clearly defined roles within your negotiating team. No agreeing to major points on the spot. Always take a break. Consult privately with your team. And document everything agreed immediately, even if it's just in minutes, to avoid disputes later.
Good discipline. Keep it structured.
And finally, anticipate external factors, especially in regulated sectors like finance. Regulatory bodies, maybe EU competition authorities, or the CSSF itself can become almost like silent parties at the table. They might impose conditions like needing to sell off certain assets, which then have to be written into the deal. You need to plan for that possibility.
That's fantastic practical advice. Okay, underpinning all these activities are the eternal project constraints: costs, pricing, and timelines. Let's quickly dissect those in the context of restructuring.
Right. The fundamentals. What are the typical cost buckets? You usually see two main types. First, there are one-time restructuring charges. These are direct costs linked to the operational changes, thanks for employees being let go, penalties for breaking leases early, writing down the value of assets being disposed of.
Operational costs.
Exactly. Then you have professional and project fees. These are the costs for your external advisors, lawyers, project management consultants, financial advisors doing valuations, the teams doing the due diligence.
Okay. And how do these professional services typically get priced? What models should you expect?
You see a few common models. The classic hourly rate is still prevalent. Sometimes you can get a fixed fee for a very clearly defined piece of work. You might also see project management fees quoted as a percentage of the total project cost, maybe somewhere between, say, 5 and 15%, depending on complexity. And for ongoing advisory work, a monthly retainer might be used. Each model affects how predictable your budget is.
Right. Fixed fees give more certainty, hourly rates less so. Now, why is the timeline so critical beyond just getting the deal done? You mentioned something about the time value of money.
Yes, the Project Management Institute often highlights this. Time literally is money in project scheduling. The time value of money principle means that €1 today is worth more than €1 tomorrow. So if you can strategically schedule your large expenses, the high-cost activities, as late as possible within the project's overall deadline.
A strategy called backloading.
Exactly, backloading. You can actually reduce the overall financing cost of the project because you're holding on to your cash for longer. The trade-off, though, is that it increases your schedule risk. If something gets delayed late in the project, you have less buffer.
Interesting trade-off. So how should a complex restructuring timeline actually be structured? You can't just have one long list of tasks.
No, absolutely not. You need a phased approach, breaking the whole thing down into manageable chunks, each with its own objectives, key tasks, and clear milestones.
Can you give us a sense of those typical phases?
Sure, a common structure might look like this. Phase 1, strategy and pre-merger planning. This is maybe 90 to 60 days before your target closing date. Here, you're defining the scope, doing initial due diligence, identifying all the regulations you need to comply with, putting the core team together, and drafting the first budget and timeline. The big milestone, getting formal approval to proceed.
Okay, phase 1, planning and approval.
Phase 2, negotiation and deal structuring. Now you're maybe 60 to 30 days out. This is where you're formalizing the deal structure. The key milestone is often signing a non-binding letter of intent, or LOI. Tasks include drafting the main merger agreement, arranging any necessary financing, and getting those first drafts of the legal opinion circulated.
Phase 2, hammering out the deal terms.
Phase 3, regulatory filing and stakeholder approval. This is often the most intense phase, running from about 30 days out right up to the closing day. The critical milestone here is getting your filings successfully submitted to regulators like the CSSF. The task list is long: finalizing and publishing the official draft terms, preparing those reports for employees and shareholders, holding shareholder meetings, dealing with creditor protections, getting final sign-off on all legal opinions. It's busy.
Phase 3, the regulatory and approval marathon.
And finally, Phase 4, closing and post-merger integration. This kicks off on closing day itself. The focus shifts immediately from doing the deal to making it work. Key activities are things like the actual transfer of funds and assets, integrating IT systems and operations, managing HR transitions, and then monitoring performance to see if you're achieving the synergies you planned for.
Phase 4, closing and making it real. That phased approach makes so much sense for managing complexity. Okay, let's bring this down to earth now. Thinking about the practical impact, especially regarding the Luxembourg regulator, the CSSF. Who in the fund ecosystem is most directly affected by all these requirements we've discussed?
It really touches multiple players. Clearly, the fund managers, the AIFMs, or UCITES Mancos are right in the thick of it. They're typically driving the project execution and ensuring compliance.
They own the project, essentially.
Pretty much. Then you have the boards of directors of the fund entities involved. They have the ultimate legal responsibility, the fiduciary duty. They're the ones making the final decisions and signing off.
The ultimate decision makers.
And you absolutely cannot forget the service providers, especially the depository bank and the central administrator. They are crucial for the operational side, moving assets, transferring cash, updating shareholder registers. Getting them involved early in the planning is absolutely vital for a smooth transition. If they only find out details at the last minute, you risk operational chaos.
Yeah, early engagement with ops providers seems key. Now, what about the specifics of dealing with the CSSF? The documentation and deadlines, you mentioned their eDesk platform is changing things.
It really is. The process for submitting information to the CSSF is now highly structured, mostly through their online portal, eDesk. You need to know the specific requirements. For instance, Circular CSSF 2FSF 894 outlines the package needed for fund mergers or liquidations, things like the updated prospectus, the formal liquidation merger date.
Specific documents, specific formats.
Exactly. And for UCITES mergers, CSSF Regulation 1005 is very prescriptive about the information that has to go to unit holders. It needs to be clear, easy to understand, non-technical, and crucially, it must explain their right to redeem their shares free of charge before the merger happens.
In the eDesk platform itself, it's not just email anymore.
No, it's much more than that. It represents a shift towards needing structured data. This actually creates a new technical dependency in your project plan.
How so?
Your team needs to ensure that the documents and data you prepare internally can be submitted in the specific file formats and templates eDesk requires. That same Circular 25894, for example, mentions needing to convert certain files to a specific PDF text format.
So it's not just what you submit, but how you submit it technically.
Precisely. Getting that upload successful notification and formal acceptance via eDesk is now part of the definition of done for your regulatory filing task.
Yeah.
Mess up the format, and you risk rejection and delays that can cascade through the whole closing timeline.
Given everything we've discussed, the complex mobility law, the notary's new powers, multiple legal opinions, intricate CSSF filings via eDesk, it really sounds like trying to do this without community. The need for counsel, experienced legal and project management support would be brave.
Brave is one word for it. I'd say exceptionally risky. The sheer number of interdependent legal, regulatory, and operational steps across potentially multiple jurisdictions, it's a minefield.
Yeah.
A single misstep, misunderstanding a rule, missing a deadline, submitting the wrong format could have really severe financial and reputational consequences. Success really demands a coordinated team effort. You need lawyers who know the specific regimes inside out, and you need project managers who can orchestrate all these moving parts. It's absolutely a collaborative effort, not something to try DIY.
That's a very clear message. So we've covered a lot of ground on the current state of play, but this area doesn't stand still. Looking ahead, what's the bigger picture? Where is this all heading?
You're right, it's definitely dynamic. These changes, like the Mobility Directive, aren't happening in isolation. They're really part of a much larger long-term project at the EU level, the push towards a deeper capital markets union, or CMU.
CMU. We hear that acronym a lot. What's the ultimate goal there?
The big idea behind CMU is to make it easier for money and investment to flow across borders within the EU, to help businesses, especially smaller ones, access more diverse types of funding, and to create a more unified, efficient single market for capital.
So making the EU function more like a single financial market.
That's the ambition, and we've seen other pieces of this puzzle fitting into place too.
Like the cross-border distribution of funds package, the CBDF rules.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was another key step. It brought in harmonized EU rules for things like pre-marketing new funds to professional investors before a full launch, and also for the process of denotifying a fund if you want to stop selling it in a particular country. It's all about reducing friction for cross-border activity.
So the trend is towards more harmonization, more integration, driven from the top down.
Generally, yes. And we can expect bodies like the European Securities and Markets Authority, ESMA, to continue playing a big role in this. They'll keep issuing guidelines, technical standards, Q&As, trying to nudge the national regulators like the CSSF towards more consistent approaches.
With a likely focus on
Transparency and investor protection usually remain top priorities. So the bottom line for project managers, the regulatory environment is not going to stand still. You need to build in a proactive regulatory scanning process, keeping an eye on the horizon for upcoming EU directives, ESMA papers, CSSF circulars to anticipate changes and make sure your processes stay compliant.
continuous monitoring becomes part of the job. Okay, fantastic. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's quickly hit those 3 key takeaways again, just to really crystallize the main messages.
Good idea.
First takeaway, that new mobility framework in Luxembourg is a big deal. The Law of 17, February 2025, bringing in the EU directive, creates that tougher special regime for intra-EU deals. And the huge change is the notary becoming a real gatekeeper with anti-abuse checks. That changes your risk planning significantly.
Absolutely. Takeaway number 2. Those legal opinions are not just box ticking. They are fundamental project dependencies, your jurisdictional green lights. You need local opinions for each relevant country, and getting them finalized is a negotiation, a mini project in itself that needs dedicated management and early attention.
Right. And the third takeaway, understanding the dual nature of conflict of laws. You've got the classic legal issue, which country's law applies to what, Lexatus, etc., needing parallel legal advice. And then you've got the separate mandatory regulatory duty for fund managers to actively manage conflicts of interest through policies and procedures. 2 distinct challenges needing 2 distinct project approaches.
You've got it. And maybe one final thought to leave you with.
Please.
Given all these added layers, more scrutiny, powerful gatekeepers like notaries, the absolute need for different experts like lawyers and PMs to work together seamlessly on these cross-border deals, how might this change fund management companies themselves over the next few years?
Interesting question.
Will we see new internal roles emerge, maybe dedicated cross-border transaction teams? Will firms need to build different internal capabilities to handle this growing complexity effectively? It's something worth thinking about.
That's a great question to ponder. How the operational structure might need to evolve to meet these new demands. Excellent food for thought. This podcast contains content generated or is significantly edited using artificial intelligence tools. All information is provided for general informational purposes only and reflects knowledge available at the time of publication. It does not constitute financial, investment, or legal advice. We recommend that listeners verify the information independently and consult with qualified professionals for personalized advice. Hit that like and subscribe button. It was the Luxembourg Fundcast for you today.